Before I proceed with this program, this is just to say that later today I will be travelling out of London and will be returning to London probably in the late afternoon or perhaps even the evening on Sunday. So it's possible, highly likely to coin a phrase, that I will not be able to make a video tomorrow. My apologies, but needs must, and this is an urgent trip which has been planned for some time and which must take place. Anyway, that's just a bit of housekeeping, if you will. What is going on in this great conflict, the conflict in Ukraine and around the world in connection to it? Well, let's do what I usually do, which is look at the actual military situation first. But before discussing the situation on the front lines, I think a good place to start is to discuss a meeting which has just taken place in Putin's residence near Moscow. This is his official presidential residence. A meeting which took place there between Putin himself and Sergei Shoigu, his defense minister. Before I talk about that, however, just consider a point which I've made on previous occasions. I discussed yesterday in my previous video the long session that Putin had at the Valdai conference, this enormous and very interesting speech that he gave there, which went on for several hours. It was followed up by an extremely long question and answer session with the conference participants, which I touched on and which I'll say a little bit more about later in this video. Over the course of this question and answer session, Putin mentioned that just before he'd come and had this discussion with before he came to the Valdai conference and gave this speech and engaged in this question and answer session. He'd had a meeting with his economic advisors, the various heads of ministries, the head of the central bank, and they gave him an update about the general situation, the general state of the economy, the Russian economy. And that meant that he came to the meeting, the Valdai meeting, with all the facts and figures about the economy at his fingertips. By the way, on that issue, there was a decision taken yesterday by the Russian central bank to keep interest rates where they are at 7.5%. The central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, gave what I thought was a very typical summary of the state of the economy, which really told us, in some ways, not very much. It was one of her less revealing statements, but that's to be discussed on another day. Anyway, so Putin meets with his economic team. He then goes to Valdai conference, gives this enormous speech. He then has a Q&A, and shortly after, he has a meeting with his defense minister. The intensity at which Putin works is something which, in my opinion, is unmatched by any other world leader at this time. It's perhaps not something that is fully considered or taken into account when discussing Putin. It's not something I've noticed that his biographies ever say a great deal about. But to talk about a hard-working leader would be an underestimate. This is a man who basically keeps going all the time. Anyway, what did he discuss with Shoigu, and why is this meeting with Shoigu of interest and importance in terms of the Ukraine war? Well, the short answer is that what they discussed was the state of the partial mobilization that Putin announced on the 21st of September. And Shoigu informed Putin that the partial mobilization in terms of the call-up of reservists is now completed. And I'm going to read what Shoigu said to Putin, his report to Putin, the verbal part of his report to Putin, which is taken from the Kremlin website. And Shoigu said the following. Starting September 21st, the military enlistment offices, together with the executive authorities of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation, have been carrying out the partial mobilization effort, which involved calling up 300,000 people and deploying them to military units. Each of the regions in our country put in a significant effort. Regional governors, as well as other levels of executive authorities, including municipal and regional bodies, provided invaluable assistance and support. In the course of the partial mobilization, more than 1,300 representatives of executive authorities have been called up, as well as over 27,000 entrepreneurs. As many as 13,000 Russians volunteered to fulfill their duty before any mobilization notices were served to them. The average age of mobilized Russians is 35. At an early stage, there were problems with various types of supplies and subsistence for the mobilized. These problems have been resolved. All those deployed to their units are provided with the required supplies, uniforms, equipment and food at the same standard as professional military personnel serving under contract. Particular emphasis is placed on the proper training of newly mobilized reservists. At present, 218,000 people are in combat training as part of crews or units in training grounds and training centers and grounds. After completing the training, 82,000 reservists were sent to the area of the special military operation, including more than 41,000 who joined units there. Those who see action will receive the status of combat veteran and the corresponding package of social benefits. All recruits called up under the mobilization have been deployed today. No more notices are being served. The target you set, 300,000 people, has been achieved. No additional objectives are planned. Military enlistment officers will continue to staff the troops for the special military operation only by accepting volunteers and candidates planning to join the service under contract. This concludes my report. So, this mobilization has been carried through. It's taken about a month for all the people to be called up. Not bad, given the size of this operation. And according to Shoigu, there were some teething problems at the start. Russian media were full about this. The Defense Ministry discussed this in detail. But these teething problems over the course of the partial mobilization have been sorted out. And I think this is probably correct. Now, I'm not, a person who's able to follow every step of this mobilization. Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has provided an interesting video, a good video in my opinion, discussing the course of the partial mobilization, and has pointed out that some of the issues with it are identical to what happens when reservists are called up in any country, including the United States and Britain as well. I believe I.L. Gray has said something similar. I mean, I haven't seen his particular video on that particular topic. But anyway, the overall fact is that the 300,000 men have been called up. And the important thing to notice is that 41,000 men have already joined the combat units. In other words, they're already there in the military units that are engaging in the fighting in Ukraine. I say in Ukraine, let me repeat again that of course these four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, are now in Russian eyes formally a part of the Russian Federation. And of course, the rest of the world doesn't recognise that. The Western powers certainly don't. And for ease of reference, as this is a war that continues to take place in what was pre-2014 Ukraine, I'm going to still refer to it as the war in Ukraine. Anyway, all of these troops have been called up. 41,000 are now with combat units, and there's another 40,000 plus apparently also in the area of the special military operation. And they're presumably being trained, and some of them are being, no doubt, used for all kinds of tasks behind the front lines. And I think one of the other interesting things to note about Shoigu's report is that the average age of the people called up is 35. Now that points to some interesting facts about this call up. As I've discussed previously, a significant proportion of the people who've been called up, unquestionably that includes the 40,000 who've already joined the military units. These are people who were recently in the army. They're probably men in their 20s, combat soldiers, people who presumably left the army over the course of this year, perhaps last year. In other words, these are recent people who have recently been involved in combat in the army as contract soldiers, and some of them probably are already veterans of this Ukraine war. But the military has also called up older men, perhaps even some women, but I get the sense that it's overwhelmingly men, and not all of them, I suspect, are going to be infantry combat soldiers. Some of them are various types of technicians, people who will undertake logistical tasks, people who will operate, trucks, drive trucks, perhaps also some mechanized units like, tank drivers and that kind of thing. And those will be the older men. The younger men, I suspect, are being allocated to the infantry. They're the people who were called up most recently. Some of the older men are going to be kept back for logistical tasks, though some of them who are specialists in the artillery and in the tank forces, you may see some of the older men being called up there. And of course, the other category of older men will be officers, people who have experience of command, and they obviously tend to be older than some of the infantry fighters, the actual frontline soldiers who are being called up as well. Not that I should say officers are necessarily, at least in the Russian army, kept away from the front lines. As I've explained many times, Russian officers are expected to be there leading their men in battle, and this happens to a much greater extent than is the case in Western armies. So overall, we see already a very substantial reinforcement of Russian forces in this conflict zone. 41,000 men have already joined the units that are fighting on the battlefields. Now, I'm going to make one further point here, which is that these reservists, up to now, are being sent to rebuild the numbers in existing units. There's no sign so far that entirely new units are being created. And I think that makes complete sense. In fact, that's the way in which most mobilizations of this kind take place. You don't go about setting up entirely new units. At least initially, you reinforce, you build up the existing units which already have operating command structures and with serving officers and where the existing soldiers are already experienced in battle and are combat ready. Now, having said that, I suspect that there will be some new formations created in time. That's probably why quite a lot of officers have been called up. And note that although around 80,000 men are now in the conflict zone and 40,000 have joined the existing units, there's still around 220,000 to come. And that brings me to my next point, because the fact that the Russian forces have been reinforced by these 40,000 men has already made a difference. I noticed yesterday that there's been a whole string of reports in the Western media which have begun to admit that the Ukrainian offensives have essentially come to a stop. They don't quite put it in that kind of dramatic way, but even the Western media is now forced to admit that the Ukrainian offensives that began at the end of August appear to have run out of steam. And of course there's several factors at play. Ukrainian losses, the fact that Ukraine is perhaps starting to run short of equipment and even men. We know that Ukraine has suffered very heavy losses over the course of these offensives. The Ukrainians sometimes admit that themselves. Then there's the deteriorating weather picture, and this is talked about to an inordinate extent back in September, and that does seem to be now the case. This situation has become rainy on the battlefields, the ground has become softer. The Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov has actually come out and said that this is affecting the movement of wheeled vehicles on soft ground, and it's one of the factors that has slowed down offensive operations. But I think the biggest single reason why offensive operations by Ukraine are running out of steam is the fact that the Russians are now steadily being reinforced across the battlefields. So we've seen significant Russian build-up in Kherson region. We've seen Russian forces starting to launch attacks in Kharkiv region and northern Donbass, where before they'd been on the defensive. And none of this would be possible if there'd not been this heavy reinforcement of Russian forces, which is what Shoigu is talking about. Now, of course, that's not the only factor, even in terms of military decision-making that the Russians have taken. The pullback from Kharkiv region, the pullback from northern Kherson region has shortened the front lines, and that has made them denser, more easy to reinforce, made it more difficult for Ukraine to launch attacks against these shorter, denser Russian front lines. And there is now an accumulation of evidence that the Russians have built up fortifications along many of these front lines, that they've started to do things that they weren't doing to any great extent earlier in the course of this conflict. They're laying mines, they're building tank barriers, they're doing all sorts of things, which, by the way, in parenthesis, Ukraine is now also doing along the border with Belarus, but that's a matter to be discussed on another day. But for the moment, the Russians are doing all of that. They're reinforcing. The Ukrainians maybe are getting weaker, and it's starting to affect the battle. In fact, it's affecting the battle quite a lot. We see that Ukraine is not able any longer to keep pushing forward. And that, I have to say, is not for lack of trying. Now, over the last few weeks, there's been, as I said, no major change on the battlefronts. except possibly in Bakhmut city and near Donetsk city, where in fact the Russians are advancing. I'm going to discuss that in a moment. But elsewhere, where Ukraine has been trying to attack, they've not been making any progress. They haven't been able to advance from Liman. On the contrary, from what one can tell, it's the Russians who are advancing now in the Liman area. There were some reports yesterday that they're starting to get quite close, actually, to Liman itself, and that they seem to be, pushing the Ukrainians back there. There's been no sign of any significant Ukrainian advances in Kherson region. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine hasn't continued to launch attacks in all of these places. On the contrary, not a day passes when I don't get reports from various, essentially principally Russian Telegram channels. The accuracy of these reports I don't in any way question. But no day passes when I don't hear about Ukrainian attacks on this part of the front or on that part of the front. The Ukrainians hammering away constantly, trying to achieve breakthroughs, trying to weaken the Russian front lines in some place. And what has invariably happened over the last few weeks is that the Ukrainians launch an attack somewhere along the front lines. Usually they're launching attacks in more than one place along these very long front lines. Invariably, they get shelled by the Russian artillery, which is becoming, it seems, ever more powerful again. And even as Ukraine's artillery apparently weakens, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. But anyway, invariably they get pounded by the Russian artillery. They run into Russian infantry, fortified infantry. They become subjected to Russian armored counterattacks, and they're thrown back. Usually, if you believe what the Russians say, which, by the way, mainly I do, with heavy losses. So Ukraine continues to bash its head, if you like, against what is becoming an ever thicker brick wall. I have to say that I do find this approach Ukraine is taking extremely strange. And again, I'm going to come to that shortly. But it's not just along these front lines where Ukraine has previously been on the offensive that this pattern has repeated itself. We see this in the battle in Bakhmut as well. Now, the story of the Bakhmut battle is a really very intriguing one. Ukraine has apparently decided that Bakhmut must be held at all costs. I'm not sure that makes much sense. But again, to those who doubt Bakhmut's importance, the fact that the Ukrainians seem to be clinging on desperately in Bakhmut is surely a sign of the importance that they attribute to the fight for Bakhmut. So Ukrainian troops are sent to Bakhmut. They get heavily shelled by Russian artillery. They find themselves in fights with the Russian forces, spearheaded by the Wagner organization, though it's quite clear that the Wagner troops are only some of the troops that are carrying out these attacks in Bakhmut and Bakhmut city and in the areas round about. Ukrainian forces get hammered. They are then pulled back, not very far, but they get pulled out of Bakhmut city. It's becoming increasingly difficult to do that, by the way, because the Russians are now able to shell the roads that lead into Bakhmut. There's a railway line that also leads into Bakhmut. So far, Ukraine has been able to send trains through to Bakhmut. One wonders for how much longer they'll be able to do that. But anyway, that's what the Ukrainians do. They pull their troops out of Bakhmut to reinforce them. But they always send more troops in. And in the meantime, the Russians incrementally, step by step, capture more locations around Bakhmut. They take more of the industrial zone. They advance deeper into the city. They gradually take more of the surrounding villages, essentially the suburbs of Bakhmut. They gradually tighten their ring around Bakhmut. And what the Ukrainians also do is that they try and launch counterattacks. Whenever the Russians capture some ground, the Ukrainians invariably counterattack. And the story of these counterattacks is that almost without exception, there have been actually one or two exceptions, but they've never changed the actual course of the battle, but almost without exception, these counterattacks get repelled with heavy losses. And the same happens, is happening, by the way, in the other place, in Donetsk, where the Russians have been on the attack right through the summer and the autumn, which is around Donetsk city. So the Russians gradually crack these defenses around Donetsk city. The Ukrainian military launches counterattacks, tries to recapture ground, lost ground, is nearly always, in fact, as far as I can tell, in Donetsk city specifically, is always repelled with heavy losses, but that doesn't prevent them doing it. This must be an extremely expensive way of conducting war. But that's what Ukraine is doing. It's refusing to do what one might think is the militarily rational thing, at least as far as I can see, which is to perhaps pull back from Bakhmut, try to preserve troops, try to preserve these forces that Ukraine built up with so much difficulty through the summer and late spring. Instead of that, Ukraine continues to fritter them away in penny packet attacks along the front lines and bashing, as I said, its head against an ever-thickening wall. And of course this plays directly into the strategy outlined 2 weeks ago in that interview he gave to Russian television by General Surovikin, the overall Russian commander, in which he spoke about the Russian military grinding Ukraine's forces down. We talked about that so much over the course of this war. It's been, in effect, the overall Russian approach right the way through. The Russians have never, up to now, sought big, dramatic breakthroughs. They're just grinding down the Ukrainian forces. And this pattern of Ukrainian attacks and counterattacks, repelled with heavy losses, and with the Russians gradually taking back the initiative, regaining ground step by step. Well, that, of course, that strategy of Ukraine launching those attacks and counterattacks, it seems to play exactly into the Russian approach. Now, I say that we've just had more information of more Ukrainian attacks over the course of the last 24 hours of a somewhat more dramatic nature. There seems to have been a very complex operation to launch drone attacks on Sevastopol, and this seems to have involved both aerial drones and naval drones, drones that operate on the sea. I'm not quite sure whether these were underwater or overwater drones, but anyway, they were drones. And the Russians are saying that every one of these drones was destroyed. They're also saying, by the way, that the entire operation was monitored by a US Global Hawk surveillance drone, which was keeping track on the whole operation from international waters. So there we go. So there was that rather complicated operation which is underway. And the Russians are also saying that there was a another attempt by Ukraine to launch some kind of amphibious strike force across the Kakhovka reservoir to try to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And that too was repelled, also with heavy losses. The whole thing has a quality of Ukraine trying and trying and trying again, doing the same thing, hoping each time for a different result. Well, perhaps sometimes, if you try the same thing often enough, maybe it will succeed. But again, as I said, it does seem a very profligate use of resources. And of course, one does wonder how much longer this game of attrition that the Russians are fighting is going to continue, because we see how fortifications, reinforcements, deteriorating weather have already essentially brought Ukrainian offensives to a halt. But that's only with reinforcements of 40,000 men. There's still hundreds of thousands of men being trained up. And these, of course, are for ex-military people. So they'll be presumably joining the military fairly soon. Hundreds of thousands of men going to reinforce the Russian forces fairly soon. And if Ukraine cannot achieve decisive breakthroughs against these existing forces, and if 40,000 men rejoining the Russian military is making such a difference, what will happen when 100,000, 200,000 out of these 300,000 men who've been called up, not to mention the 70,000 plus volunteers we also hear have elected to join the military at this time? What happens when all of these forces join up too? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to make a guess that at that point, Russian options will become greater. And the Russians are, at that point, going to start doing much more aggressive things. Now, as to what those are, I can only guess, and my guesses are as good as anybody else's. But I'm going to venture a few guesses of my own. Now, let me stress, these are guesses. I may be completely wrong, but I personally think it's unlikely that the Russians are planning attacks on Kiev or on Volyn from the north from Belarus. I think that these Russian forces that have been deployed in Belarus are simply not large enough for that kind of offensive operation. I don't think the Russians will want to divert large numbers of men to the northern direction. They look fairly the whole deployment looks fairly defensive to me. I would have thought, and this is consistent with what Surovikin has been saying, that the Russians are more likely to be focusing on the four regions, on tidying up the situation in the four regions. And we've been getting reports now that, as well as the pressure on Bakhmut city and on the area around Donetsk city, there's also apparently some kind of a Russian push towards the southern Donetsk town of Ugledar. There was a report yesterday that the first line of defense around Ugledar has now collapsed. Ukrainian defense around Ugledar has collapsed, that the Russians are getting closer to Ugledar itself. Now, this is an important town. It's not huge, but it does apparently form a linchpin in the Ukrainian supplies from the much bigger city of Zaporozhye to the Ukrainian defenses opposite Donetsk city. So all of this is interconnected, and the closer the Russians get to capturing Ugleda, the more difficult Ukrainian positions in Donetsk city apparently also become, and the closer the Russians get to the position they want to be in, which is one of clearing the entirety of Donbass. So I think that is one thing that the Russians are going to do. And I think that there are two other areas where the Russians are going to be particularly interested in, apart from clearing Donbass, which Putin, by the way, over the course of his Q&A at the Valdai conference, stressed again was the overriding priority for the Russian military, clearing Donbass, ending the military, the shelling of Donetsk city, bringing the situation in Donbass finally under control, ending the Ukrainian pressure on what was formerly the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So apart from that, I think the Russians will probably focus over the next few weeks and months after November on strikes towards Zaporozhye, the city that remains outside Zaporozhye region. Russians have incorporated Zaporozhye region into Russia, but they say that Zaporozhye city is part of Zaporozhye region, so that clearly signals their intention to take control of Zaporozhye city. It's a big city, major industrial center. As I said, the Mobilisation gas turbine, a turbine, helicopter, engine building plant there is located there. By the way, Ukraine has recently arrested the manager of the Mobilisation plant, accusing him of treason. Quite an interesting thing, but supposedly he was in contact with the Russians. A rather disturbing affair about which we have few details at the moment. But as I said, I would have thought that the Russians would be focused on capturing Zaporozhye, and I'm going to guess that their other priority is to secure their positions around Kherson region, which could mean advances on Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog to the north of Kherson region, but it would also mean capturing Nikolaev, this important town, city on the southern Bug River, which was previously a major armament center of the Russian Navy with its great shipyard, where the Soviet fleet used to build its aircraft carriers, that the Russians will want to take Nikolaev eventually. And can I just say, there's been something else which makes a possible advance to Nikolaev important, because, of course, Nikolaev is the last big city before Odessa. And Putin made some very interesting comments about Odessa over the course of that Q&A at the Valdai conference. Now, here I have to be extremely careful because the Kremlin has not yet provided an official translation into English. But I'm going to do what I detest doing, which is I'm going to turn to a machine translation. There's various translations floating around, but they all seem to me to be based ultimately on machine translations. And in this particular case, I don't think it's particularly, the words are particularly complex, so I think a machine translation will do. But anyway, over the course of the Q&A, he was asked by a person, a Mr. Gabor Stier, whose name, by the way, suggests that he's Hungarian, at least to me, whether he should, well, this is the question that Mr. Steer put to Putin. One of my favorite cities in the post-Soviet space is Odessa. What do you think? Give me advice. If I would like to go there next summer or in 2 years, should I ask for a Russian or Ukrainian visa? And Putin then replied as follows. You know, Odessa is indeed one of the most beautiful cities in the world. As you know, Odessa was founded by Catherine II, and even extreme nationalists, in my opinion, do not dare to demolish the monument to the founder of the city. Odessa can be both a bone of contention and a symbol of conflict resolution, and a symbol of finding some solution to everything that is happening now. The issue is not with us. We have said many times that we are ready for negotiations, and I, recently speaking in the Kremlin, publicly mentioned this again. But the leaders of the Kiev regime decided not to continue negotiations with the Russian Federation. However, the decisive word belongs to those who implement this policy in Washington. It is very simple to solve this problem, to give an appropriate signal to Kiev that they should change their position and strive to solve these problems peacefully. That's all. And as for your possible trip to Odessa, I recommend that you do it. This is a really good, beautiful city with wonderful traditions and history. It's worth admiring it. True, in recent years, at least when I was in Odessa, it did not make the best impression on me because the public utilities were clearly in decline. This is evident even from the facades of the buildings, although there seemed to be nothing in the centre yet. Still, it was preserved a little to the side. Everything already looked not so presentable there. But Odessa is worth seeing. Now, a bit garbled perhaps at the end because, as I said, I am working with the machine translation, but surely something instantly stands out, which is that Putin didn't answer Mr. Steer's question. He didn't say whether in 2 years' time one should take a Ukrainian or a Russian visa if one wanted to visit Odessa. What Putin is saying here is, well, we could negotiate, there could be negotiations. Odessa is a beautiful city, it's got this tremendous history. If Ukraine sits down and negotiates, we might come to some point of agreement about Odessa, and that would be part of an overall settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. It could become a symbol of conflict resolution. But Ukraine refuses to negotiate, and Washington refuses to allow Ukraine to negotiate. So, in the absence of negotiations, what will happen? Putin doesn't say. What he does say is that Odessa is in very bad shape. By the way, I've heard from someone who's actually travelled there that this is true, that it is actually quite run down. And of course, what Putin didn't mention here, though he mentions it very much on other occasions, is that for Russians, Odessa is not only an enormously important city, very much a part of their history, their modern history, and their culture. Notice that Putin refers to the fact that its founder is Catherine II, Catherine the Great, in other words, the Russian Empress. But, of course, what most Russians know about Odessa was that in 2014, there was a terrible incident there when a lot of protesters who were opposing the Maidan takeover in Ukraine, and many of whom had Russian flags, were burnt to death in the trade union building in Odessa. And this is a horrible event which has resounded across Russia and which Putin himself often talks about. But the key point is that just as at that press conference he gave in Astana about 10 days ago, Putin did not commit to the survival of the Ukrainian state beyond the war, so he did not commit to Odessa definitely remaining part of a Ukrainian state beyond the war. What he's essentially saying is if Ukraine wants to keep Odessa, then it needs to start negotiating. And it's not his fault that Ukraine is not negotiating, and that by not negotiating, Ukraine is putting its position in increasing peril. It may lose Odessa. That's the implication. That's the only possible implication I can take from these words. It may eventually lose its entire statehood, which is again the only implication I can draw from his words at the conference, the press conference in Astana. Well, we will see what happens. I mean, it's important to stress at the moment we're talking about potential Russian offensives. They're not yet taking place, though I think we are gradually edging in that direction. Now, I've quoted previously from Russian TASS reports, and I want to stress these are TASS reports, and they're not necessarily the most reliable reports about what is actually going on the battle lines. And I want to stress that these are Russian accounts of what's going on. I'm not referencing them based on the truth of any assumption of the truth of their contents. It's simply that, as I said, they do give a general sense of the mood that the Russians have, or Russian officials have at the moment. And one TASS report from yesterday said the following, that Allied forces are advancing along almost the entire line of contact, and this is apparently said by the acting head of the Donetsk Republic, Denis Pushilin, and he said he's quoted as saying, "We can see our forces advancing along almost the entire line of contact. Undoubtedly, it's not yet about liberating several settlements at once, but at this point, simply advancing is important. Even 100 or 200 meters matter when it means better positions." So, according to Pushilin, and this may not be, true, but what he's saying, what he's telling the people of Donbass, what he's telling the people of Russia, is that far from Ukraine advancing at the moment, it is Russia, it is the Russians who are advancing. And that, it seems to me, is an interesting fact in itself. And another article, again from TASS, and it's been published today, points to declines in Ukrainian artillery fire. This is said this time by another official of the Donetsk Republic, somebody called Andrei Bayevsky. And Mr. Bayevsky is quoted as saying that the Ukrainian armed forces continue to carry out shelling attacks. However, we can see that the daily number of munitions they fire at our settlements in Donetsk has declined to 160 to 180, whilst the average daily number was 400 in the summer and reached 600 on some days. And elsewhere, the Russians have also reported, there's another report from TASS, which apparently says that Ukraine is now increasingly relying on long-range artillery, HIMARS, and other multiple rocket launch systems, and also long-range guns 152 and 155 millimeter guns, because presumably it's run out of ammunition for its shorter range guns. All of which is interesting and is consistent again with the breakdown of Ukrainian ammunition stocks, which we've been reading about. Again, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas is the person who's processed the figures best, but it does seem as if Ukraine's ammunition stocks for artillery are indeed running down too. So, growing confidence, or so it seems to me from the Russian side. Even the Western media is now admitting that Ukrainian offensives are at a stop, and we've seen this report from the Kremlin, which gives some reason why the mobilization is starting to make, the Russian mobilization is starting to make a difference. And elsewhere, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Macgregor, one of the best analysts of the war, in my perspective, is also talking about the situation deteriorating for Ukraine as the mobilization develops. Well, we will see what happens. Now, I'm going to finish this video with a, I thought, really rather bizarre, indeed extraordinary, and in some ways rather sad speech by the German president, Mr. Steinmeier. Now, I have to say, Steinmeier is somebody I've followed for a long time. He's always struck me as one of the more level-headed people in the German political system. But he's now come back from Kiev, where he had a meeting with Zelensky, and was apparently in an air raid shelter for a time because the Russians were continuing their missile offensive against Ukraine. I'm told, by the way, that even though the volume of missiles has declined, the reason for that is not because the Russians have fewer missiles and drones, but simply because the number of targets has gradually shrunk as more and more of the obvious targets have been dismantled and been knocked out. But anyway, the missile offensive and the drone offensive continues. Steinmeier for a time in a shelter, but anyway, he's got back to Germany and he's given an extraordinarily bitter speech. And in it, he said that policy towards Russia has been a total failure. He's talking, of course, about the policy of engagement with Russia, which Germany has followed ever since, presumably, the 1960s with Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. But perhaps he means more precisely the policy of engagement which Germany has followed with Russia since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Anyway, he talks about how this has failed and failed completely. He talked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine being a manifestation of evil. He talked about how Germany cannot accept any compromise which allows Russian troops to remain in Ukraine. And from what I could tell from his words, he means any part of Ukraine, including presumably Crimea, which would mean, by the way, if Steinmeier is to be taken at his word, that Steinmeier is now talking about a permanent rupture of German relations with Russia. And of course, all of this, even as we get news that German industries contracting, prices in Germany are rising. There's a couple of people who've got very excited about the fact that natural gas prices in Europe have fallen recently. I suspect this is a temporary phenomenon, but it's been suggested to me that one reason why gas prices in Europe have fallen is because there's less consumption, because industrial users are not using gas. So, that would suggest factories are operating below capacity in Germany at the moment. And why that is a good thing escapes me. But anyway, that's what Steinmeier was saying. Germany must keep to this indefinitely, as far as I can see. Now, Steinmeier has historically been one of those people who has conducted positive, who has made big steps to try and conduct a positive outreach towards Russia. He was foreign minister. He's worked with Gerhard Schröder, the former SPD chancellor. He's a member of the SPD himself, Steinmeier is. And I can't help but sense that there's a sort of personal bitterness about all of this, that he's angry that the policy which he pursued as foreign minister has failed completely, and he's blaming the Russians for that, which is, at a human level, understandable. But I do have to say this. I think Steinmeier does need to reflect a little bit on his own actions. After all, a German politician, one would have thought, given German history, given German involvement in Ukraine in the First World War, and of course in the Second World War, would know how critically important Ukraine is to Russia. It's not as if the Russians haven't pointed this out incessantly. And one would have thought that a German politician would have realized that the importance for Germany, for Europe, and indeed for the West, of treading in Ukraine very carefully. But what was Steinmeier's own role? Well, he was one of the foreign ministers who negotiated what appeared to be an agreement between President Yanukovych and the opposition in February 2014 to hold elections in Ukraine at the end of 2014. The opposition immediately tore up that agreement and seized power. And Steinmeier had nothing to say about that at the time. He went along with it. And then a short time later, when the situation in Ukraine deteriorated, there was some attempts, as I remember, by the Russians and the Germans and others, and the then president of Ukraine, President Poroshenko, seemed to be going along with that, to come to some kind of peaceful resolution of the crisis in Donbass. This is before any fighting began, or any serious fighting began. But instead, in June 2014, President Poroshenko of Ukraine launched a military offensive to try to take back Donbass by force. Now, there's various reports, various suggestions that Steinmeier advised Poroshenko against doing that. But if Steinmeier did give that advice, Poroshenko ignored him. And then, of course, Steinmeier was German foreign minister a couple of months later when the Minsk II agreement was concluded. And he played a role, presumably, in the drafting of the Minsk II agreement. And we've now had various reports which suggest that Angela Merkel and presumably Steinmeier himself played a bigger role in the original draft, creating the original draft of the Minsk agreement that had previously been appreciated. Well, Ukraine failed to implement the Minsk agreement. And then again, a short while later, some years later, when it looked like the negotiations to implement the Minsk agreement were at a complete standstill, Steinmeier proposed various modifications to the sequencing, which the Russians accepted, except that the Ukrainians appeared to accept that sequencing, but never carried it out. So we see a pattern of Ukrainian obstruction. And of course, Poroshenko himself has told us this is the former president of Ukraine, that he never had any intention of implementing the Minsk agreement at all. He simply signed them in order to buy time. So Ukrainian obstruction, and what was Steinmeier doing over all of those years? As I said, he was the foreign minister. He's then the president. He's somebody who is intimately familiar with the diplomacy. As a German, he ought surely to have known what a sensitive issue Ukraine was for Russia. And yet, none of the blame, according to him, for what has gone wrong attaches to him. It's all Russia's fault, Putin's fault, and the fact that the war is taking place is a manifestation of evil, not, of course, on his part, but on the Russian part. I have to say, I find all this very bizarre and at some levels very sad. Reading Steinmeier's words, it seems to me that he seems to have talked himself into this idea that Germany's interactions with Russia were not really to try to work with Russia to find acceptable compromises to secure peace. They were intended in some way to influence Russia and to change Russia in a way that would be to the ultimate benefit of Germany and the West. And his anger and his bitterness is because, of course, that never happened. But was it ever likely to? Was that ever a realistic option? Was this something that statesmen should ever try to do? Not interact with the leaders of another country in order to deal with that country as it is and to accept its policies and understand its interests and its concerns, but to try to change and alter that country in some way in order to suit oneself. Is that something that statesmen ought to be doing? Is it not an incredibly risky thing? Anyway, that, it seems to me, accounts for Steinmeier's bitterness. And I have to come here now to a very fine article by Anatol Lieven in Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, written, by the way, before Steinmeier gave this bizarre speech. At least I find it bizarre. I mean, to me, it shows the extraordinary lack of self-awareness of Western politicians, including, of course, in this case, German ones. But Lieven makes the point that one of the reasons why German policy is in this crisis, they can't negotiate with the Russians. They can't acknowledge that the Russians have a point of view, that they can't accept that German actions had any bearing at all on the making of this crisis, is because German leaders, for a very, very long time, wanted, when it came to Russia, to have their cake and eat it as well. They wanted cheap energy from Russia. They wanted the gas because that was essential to keeping German industry competitive. Not just, getting Germany through winter, but keeping it competitive in the long term. And Lieven makes a good discussion of how important that is for the Germany's concept of itself, its self-identity, that Germany can't just deindustrialize in the way that other countries have done. That would be a massive psychological change for Germany. So the Germans wanted that cheap energy to keep their industries humming. But at the same time, they went along with NATO and EU expansion. And they never confronted, they were never prepared to confront the fact that these two policies were in contradiction. They wanted the cheap energy, but they were never prepared to understand that NATO and ultimately EU expansion as well undermined that policy. It looks to me, from Steinmeier's words, that what they were telling themselves all the time is, let's just keep going. Sooner or later, something's going to happen. That terrible man, Mr. Putin, is going to go away. Some liberal figure, maybe Navalny, will take over from him, and we'll be able to keep getting all that cheap energy. We'll get the Russians into the third energy package. We'll do all of these things, and we'll never have to deal with the consequences of this contradiction. And now it's become obvious that that's not going to be how things are going to turn out. But rather than admit to the German people that NATO and EU expansion were the tragic error at the heart of this crisis, we have people like Steinmeier talking about their own bitterness and the evil of the other side. When leaders talk in this way, when statespeople use this kind of language, then I'm afraid you have to say to yourself that we are in a position where real statesmanship has vanished. And that, I'm afraid, is where we are with Germany now. Well, I've talked for more than an hour again, long program. I have to finish now. I'll come back soon, perhaps not tomorrow. As I said, I'm traveling later today. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course Rockfin. And you can also support us if you like our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, don't forget to go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And if you've liked this video, tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Again, lots of things covered today in this ever more complicated crisis. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon with my next update, which may be on Monday, realistically, and have a very good day until then.